This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Three months on, how effective has Africa's COVID-19 response been? Brazil is now the epicenter of the outbreak in Latin America. And in Somalia, thousands flee as water levels rise in the Shabelle River. Hello and a warm welcome to Africa Live on CGTN. I'm Lindy Mtongana in Nairobi. Also coming up this hour. In business, falling global crude prices give Nigeria an opportunity to cancel its controversial fuel subsidy. And in sports, South Africa's NTT Pro Cycling takes stock of coronavirus disruptions. We start the program with the latest updates on the spread of the coronavirus on the African continent. There are over 73,000 confirmed cases and more than 26,000 recoveries across Africa. The death toll stands at over 2,500. Well, let's break down the numbers by region. North Africa has over 23,000 recorded cases. Almost half of the cases come from Egypt. Meanwhile, Algeria has started producing rapid test kits for the coronavirus. The government announced the tests would have a detection time of 15 minutes. Authorities added there was a production capacity of 200,000 units per week. In West Africa, Ghana and Nigeria continue to record the highest number of cases. Both countries have taken steps to ease lockdown measures. Senegal has also joined both countries in easing measures. President Macky Sall announced churches and mosques would be reopened. Senegalese will also see their curfew shortened by an hour and weekly markets reopened. East Africa has the lowest number of recorded deaths on the continent, with several countries not registering any deaths so far. However, countries like Somalia, Sudan and Djibouti have recorded over 1,000 cases. The Djibouti government has been easing lockdown measures. The Africa CDC has, however, said the country has the highest number of cases on the continent relative to its population. In Central Africa, Cameroon continues to record the highest number of cases. The country is dealing with both conflict in its Anglophone region and the COVID-19 pandemic. Its regional neighbor, the DRC, has the second highest recorded number of cases in that region. The country is also dealing with conflict while trying to manage multiple outbreaks, including measles and Ebola. And South Africa's confirmed COVID-19 cases continue to dwarf its regional neighbors. The country has registered over 12,000 cases. Reported cases in countries such as Malawi, Botswana, Namibia, and others remain in the 2 digits. Meanwhile, Lesotho has confirmed its first case and is the last African country to do so. This comes as it carried out nearly 600 tests. Well, let's bring you more on this now. We're joined by Edwin Okura, the Africa Executive Director of ONE, a global NGO against poverty and preventable diseases. Edwin, thank you so much for joining us. Now, of course, Lesotho has become the last African country to report a case of the coronavirus. What do you attribute the fact that it's been corona-free up until this time? What do you attribute that to?
I think, first of all, it's the level of traffic between international traffic to and from Lesotho. So it has been quite limited, compared to the rest of Africa. And as you could see, that the test actually, the only positive test is coming from travelers who went to South Africa and Saudi Arabia. So I would say that it is more about how connected you are to the international community that also exposes you to the level of infection you can get. I will also say that it's also about the testing capacity. Like, Lesotho doesn't have the testing labs for COVID, so they have to do all their tests in South Africa. So maybe if they were doing more tests in country, we could have seen more. But for the 600 tests, or about 600 tests they've conducted for us to get only one, it actually means that there's not enough external influence in Lesotho.
And Edwin, prophets of doom have been predicting that Africa would be severely affected by this pandemic. So far, we're just over 70,000 cases. It seems we have lost our guest. We'll try and speak to him later. For now, though, let's move on with our coverage of the coronavirus. The South African government may be forced to call on the help of home-based caregivers as hospitals gradually become overstretched with a spike in coronavirus numbers. Most of the nation's COVID-19 cases have been quarantined at home, while with more than a third of cases have recovered so far. CGTN's Julie Shire has the details.
Home-based nurses dedicate their lives to taking care of the sick and the elderly. They've so far helped to keep South Africa's hospital wards clear for COVID-19 patients.
Hospitals and ourselves are working together to earlier discharge patients to home, which is in the interest of both the hospital and the patient to actually protect them in terms of going forward. So we will continue treating the elderly, not COVID positive, at home.
They may be called to join the medical corps if the outbreak takes a turn for the worse. Qualified nurse Eunice Letzi was drawn to the profession 5 years ago because of the struggle to access healthcare in her own community. She says caring for COVID-19 patients will be no different.
As a nurse, I have to take a risk to take care of our loved ones and our community, but to make sure that I'm safe. We receive a necessary information about COVID-19, how to deal with those who are infected.
We're on standby for COVID-19, and we have been equipping our staff with knowledge and expertise and best protocols on how to treat the different stages of COVID-19. We think that the not so critically ill are better served treated at home, and this trend has been carried out in many other parts of the world.
Letzi's work doesn't end with her patients. She has a responsibility to guide her own family and neighbors when she goes back home to Tembisa Township.
If I can see that the children are on the street roaming around, I'll tell them that my kids, you are at risk of getting infected of coronavirus. Please go home, stay home, do your homeworks, read your books, you can watch the TV, keep yourself distance from your friends. You'll see your friends after the coronavirus gone.
South Africa's hospitals are not yet overrun with an influx of COVID-19 patients, but should the numbers rise exponentially, carers will play a critical role in treating the sick at home and easing the burden on the public health system. Julie Shire, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, let's return now to our conversation with Edwin Okura, the Africa Executive Director of One. Edwin, thank you for rejoining us. Let's look at the fact that, prophets of doom had anticipated that Africa would suffer severely from the coronavirus pandemic. And at the moment, the numbers are a little over 70,000 in terms of confirmed cases. African countries were fairly quick to impose curfews and lockdowns and other restrictions. But overall, what is your assessment of how Africa has responded to COVID-19?
Thank you. I think that the response from Africa has actually been more severe in the sense that I would say it is more severe than the actual incidents or the health emergencies that we've seen, because we've been hit more economically than anything else. So the lockdowns that have been used, or some people will call it the confinement, that have been used to stop the spread, that is one main one. And the other part that has really hit the African continent more is in terms of the fiscal implication of that, where government are spending a lot more money trying to create new isolation centers, trying to contain the flow by blocking international borders and all of that. So the heat on the African continent has been more on the economic side than on the health side. And that is why the response has actually been overwhelmingly, an economic response or the response in terms of lockdown and just halting the spread. But in a nutshell, I would say the response has been great in terms of the proactiveness, the energy, the zeal with which African leaders began to put things in place like hand washing, social media campaign, TV and national radio campaigns on taking social distance measures and all of that, and improving hygiene and messaging about hygiene. But I would say in a nutshell, sometimes the economic impact of those measures have been really felt on the African continent.
And Edwin, we know that the coronavirus has also been something of a test for Africa's public health resources, especially when it comes to the question of testing capacity. Do you agree with the sentiment that the numbers are low because Africa hasn't done enough tests?
So I don't think it's a sentiment. I think it's actually that is the reality. The reality is that where more tests are carried out, more results are got, you see more positive cases. But honestly, I think beyond the test capacity, you would see that the health system has not been overwhelmed yet in terms of the number of cases that are rushing to the hospitals. Because even if you don't test, if the symptoms persist, you would definitely go to the hospital for care. But we haven't seen that kind of spike yet. So we would say that relatively, Africa has been less hit, than other parts of the world because we haven't seen that jump in emergency, admissions, in ICU admissions around the continent. But again, for countries where as they ramp up testing capacity, like in South Africa, you would see that the highest number that is being reported is also because of the highest number of tests that have been carried out. And so that is what gives the impression that the more tests you carry out, the more positive cases you will report or you will discover. So in a way, there are two sides to it. More tests will mean more results, more positive cases, but we still haven't seen an overwhelming of our health system yet due to ICUs or emergency admissions.
And indeed, Edwin, this particular pandemic may come and go, but there will certainly be others like it in the future. What do you think Africa will learn from how it's managed this particular pandemic in managing future pandemics on the continent?
Okay, first of all, I would start by saying that as at this point in time, 3 months after the index case on the African continent, Africa is dealing with multiple threats, not just the pandemic. There is the health and the pandemic situation that is coming up and that we're talking about. There is also the food crisis that is also hitting because of the lockdown, people are not able to access food or prices of foods are going up. Then there is also the economic part of it, which is huge debts that Africa will be incurring because if they are paying so much money from debt service, then they don't have the money to respond to that. So these triple threats are currently facing Africa. But in terms of the lessons here, it is very important to see that there is no way we can deal with a pandemic as individual countries. So one thing we're quickly learning post-pandemic is that Africa has to work together as a unit rather than as individual countries. Because in terms of access to global supply chains for medicines, for PPEs, for vaccines, or for anything that is supposed to help fight the pandemic, individual countries are doing many things. Whereas if they had done these things together as a unit, then the demand will be, then the pressure will be higher because they are speaking as one unit. But going forward, we are learning that we have to work together. The other part is that we need to begin to think about how to feed ourselves as Africans. If we do not find the way to have sufficient food security on the African continent, future pandemics will really make us worse off. And that is why we are dealing with food security crisis right now, because we are depending on the international supply chain for even feeding ourselves. So that is one. Then in terms of debt and financing, it has become clear that if you do not allocate the right resources to the health sector, you will suffer greatly. Right now, we are seeing that African countries are beginning to realize that when we call for more funding for social sector like health and education, it is because it is in the interest of the economy. Right now, the whole Africa is saying that without health, there cannot be survival, no economic survival. And these are key lessons that we are learning, and we think we should be taking forward even post-pandemic.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Edwin Okura. Joining us there via Skype, he is the Africa Executive Director of ONE. Now, Kenya's government has heightened surveillance at its border with Tanzania to curb the spread of the coronavirus. CGTN's Nick Mudimba has the details.
Hundreds of trucks parked as drivers wait to be cleared. It's been a slow process, one that has caused massive delays. But Kenyan authorities insist that all drivers plying the Kenya-Tanzania route must be tested for the virus. The drivers are a frustrated lot because they already underwent the same procedure on the Tanzanian side.
I currently have 2 certificates, one from when I was tested on entry into Uganda at Busia and another when re-entering Kenya. They do not recognize those here. They say every border point carries out tests. They should just allow passage to those of us who have already been tested and give a clean bill of health. In fact, my certificates are valid for 14 days, and these have not lapsed yet.
We're now broke due to the delays in the exercise. The officers conducting the testing come here late and leave very early, having taken very little time conducting tests. And this is costing us massively. If these delays are going to be the norm, then they should consider closing the border completely.
The number of COVID-19 cases in both Tanzania and Kenya are increasing rapidly. Tanzania government is under pressure to make public its COVID-19 cases for the month of May.
But I think that we can be able to do better. And as a result of that, the ministry is going to provide a mobile laboratory for Kajiado County to be stationed at Namanga border to ensure seamless screening of truck drivers across the border, but also the local population. This, therefore, will reduce the turnaround time for this exercise.
A few COVID-19 cases have been recorded at the Namanga border point, but health officials say they will strengthen their measures and continue screening intensively. Nick Mudimba, CGTN.
Let's head to Tunisia now, where researchers have developed a medical protection device, the first of its kind in Tunisia. It's used when transporting COVID-19 patients. Here's Edwin Okura with more.
Malik Miftah is the CEO of Energy, a Tunisian startup that has developed a medical protection device, along with Dr. Riyad Sheker, a researcher and microcomputer entrepreneur.
I've spent some time at the hospital since the outbreak of the pandemic to understand the needs of the medical and paramedical staff who are working under pressure. Transporting a COVID-19 patient is risky. Sometimes it paralyzes the whole hospital. The device protects everyone, including patients.
The inventor explains that the patient is placed inside a closed bag, which is equipped with a ventilation system and membranes to purify the air. This device will prevent any air pollution during entry or exit, thanks to a battery-powered ventilator.
Similar devices have been used in the fight against Ebola, but this one is cheaper and more efficient. This new invention is also washable, which makes it reusable at a hospital, private clinics and COVID-19 centers.
The head of National Observatory of New and Emerging Diseases said that health authorities welcome the initiatives and inventions of the private sector.
The COVID-19 crisis has revealed the talent of Tunisians who've transformed, with the support of the Ministry of Health, a pandemic into an opportunity to reinforce the prevention and vigilance system at hospitals. The inventions of our youth are impressive.
Malik and his team are working closely with the scientific committee in order to improve the medical protection device that will help reduce the risk of exposure to COVID-19 for medical and paramedical workers. The COVID-19 task force has stepped up the screening and monitoring system while relying on new inventions in the fight against the pandemic. Experts have urged the government to create a new fund which is dedicated to financing the development of new inventions and devices to help tackle coronavirus. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Well, time now for a short break. Here's what's still ahead on the program. Coming up, concern in South Sudan as the coronavirus spreads into refugee camps. And in Somalia, thousands flee as water levels rise in the Shebele River.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
The global number of confirmed COVID-19 cases has surpassed 4.3 million, with the total death toll over 296,000. The World Health Organization's emergency chief, Mike Ryan, has warned that the virus may be here to stay.
This virus may become just another endemic virus in our communities, and this virus may never go away.
Ryan says there remains hope that an effective vaccine will be developed, and he compared it with HIV, which has not been eliminated, though effective treatments are allowing people to live with the disease. He also says it will require a huge amount of work to produce coronavirus shots and distribute them worldwide to people willing to be immunized. Well, it's a grim new record for Brazil, with the country confirming a daily record of more than 11,000 new cases on Wednesday. That's more than any other single day so far. The death toll now exceeds 13,000, with more than 180,000 total infections, making Brazil the epicenter of the outbreak in Latin America. Paulo Cabral reports.
The COVID-19 numbers here in Brazil continue to climb. Despite the record deaths reported Tuesday, that record may not last long. The curve continues to point upward, and it's not yet clear when the peak of the infection will happen here in Brazil. Some states, particularly in the poorer north and northeastern regions, are already seeing their health care systems near collapse, like the state of Amazonas in the Brazilian Amazon. But despite those stretched resources and the imposition of lockdown measures in some regions, levels of social distancing have been dropping in Brazil, with more people on the streets, as you can see here on this commercial pedestrian street in the greater São Paulo area. Shops are all closed, have been like this all day, but there's visibly a higher number of people circulating here than there were just a few weeks ago. The vast majority of them are wearing masks, as I am myself. This is mandatory here in the state of São Paulo right now. Here in Brazil, all health authorities, including the Minister of Health, Nelson Teich, support social distancing as the key strategy to fight the infection. Still, President Jair Bolsonaro himself remains an outspoken critic of social distancing measures.
People have to go back to work. And who does not want to work, stay at home, damn it. Stay at home and period.
Bolsonaro's positions have isolated him in Brazilian politics, and he's now facing a political crisis on top of the ongoing public health and economic crisis. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, São Paulo.
In South Sudan, the government says the coronavirus has now spread into camps for internally displaced people. It's also worried that cases have been reported in several regions of the country. More than 188,000 people are still sheltering in camps and UN compounds in South Sudan. CGTN's Patrick Oyet reports.
South Sudan's health ministry says it is concerned that the number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the country is rising in the community, but also in camps for internally displaced persons.
We can say now the outbreak is not only centered in Juba, but areas like Yei River County have confirmed cases, 7 cases, and Abyei administrative area also have confirmed 1 case. And we have 1 case confirmed also in Unity State, Rupkone, and this case reside in the protection of civilian side in Bantu.
The United Nations is also reporting 2 cases at an IDP camp in the capital, Juba. Relative peace is returning to the country as a result of the implementation of a 2018 peace deal. However, nearly 190,000 South Sudanese people are still sheltering in the United Nations compound. Officials are worried about keeping the outbreak under control, with the outbreak now confirmed to have spread to IDP camps.
Maybe the worst is actually to come because of our weak health systems, but also we have our own peculiarities. We have populations that are affected by food insecurity, malnutrition, a high burden of tuberculosis and HIV, all of which reduce your immunity and predispose you to developing very severe disease symptoms if you contract COVID.
The crowding in the protection of civilian camps is concerning authorities, with tents used for sleeping set only 2 meters apart from each other. South Sudan's government is urging those still residing in the displaced persons camps to return to their own homes. But with the confirmed cases of COVID-19 in some of the camps, the residents will have to be tested and will only be allowed to leave if they are confirmed free of the coronavirus. Patrick Koyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
The Chinese community in South Africa is doing its best to lend a helping hand during the coronavirus pandemic. Food parcels were donated to those in need by the Africa-Shanghai General Chamber of Commerce and the South Africa-China Cross-Border Commerce Association. CGTN's Yulisa Jamela has more.
The COVID-19 pandemic has already left a trail of destruction and economic challenges, and the efforts to ensure that the spread of the virus is curbed has unintentionally left many people destitute. There are, however, organizations that are reaching out to various communities to lend a helping hand. In this case, thousands of food parcels were donated by Africa-Shanghai General Chamber of Commerce and the South Africa-China Cross-Border Commerce Association.
South Africa is the place where we live, where our families, careers, relatives, and friends are all here. In times of crisis, we are willing to do our best, our part in social responsibility, to lend a helping hand to our brothers and sisters in need, and to give them warmth in care. The love not only comes from us personally, but also it's beautiful testimony of South Africa-China friendship. The friendship between China and South Africa has a long history. It has withstood the test of time and ever-changing international situation. May we unite and help each other to fight against the epidemic and overcome the difficulties together.
A friend in need is a friend indeed. China is willing to work with South Africa wholeheartedly to strengthen cooperation in pandemic prevention and control and defeat the coronavirus in the end. So state-to-state relations rest on people-to-people exchanges, and people-to-people friendship rest on, very effective communications, heart-to-heart communications.
The donations by these entities are in support of the South African government's ongoing mass relief efforts rolled out across the country. The Progressive Business Forum hosted a ceremony in appreciation of the assistance from these companies.
South Africa and China, particularly the ANC and the Communist Party of China, have had a long relationship. From days of our struggle and until today, we continue to cooperate, to work together. We all know that to defeat the COVID-19 pandemic requires solidarity. The pandemic knows no race, no borders, so it's important that the cooperation must continue, the solidarity that is being shown by many countries must continue, because that's the only way we can defeat this pandemic.
More Chinese entities have expressed an intention to also assist communities that are in dire need. Yulisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
After 2 weeks, a Chinese medical mission charged with helping Côte d'Ivoire fight COVID-19 is now leaving the country. The 12 Chinese experts worked closely with their Ivorian counterparts. They took Ivorian health personnel through training and practical work. The Chinese medical personnel shared their experience and also took part in field visits. Their efforts to help build Côte d'Ivoire's capacity were commended by the country's health minister.
As is often said, you find out who your real friends are during difficult times. On behalf of Côte d'Ivoire, I would like to express the Ministry of Health and Foreign Affairs satisfaction with this medical mission. I wish a safe voyage to the Chinese medical experts who came to share their experience fighting COVID-19 with their Ivorian counterparts.
During our stay, we saw the many efforts made by Côte d'Ivoire to fight the pandemic. We also saw the commitment and professionalism of the Ivorian health personnel, and I hope that the experiences we shared will be very useful to Côte d'Ivoire in its fight against COVID-19. We also believe that the friendship between our two countries will be strengthened.
China and Côte d'Ivoire are good friends and partners. Since the beginning of the pandemic, our two countries have always come together to face the disease.
Well, that is where we leave our coronavirus coverage. Let's take a look now at some other news making headlines across the continent. In Sudan, at least 26 people have died in clashes in the past 2 days in the southern region of South Kordofan. The dead include 9 paramilitary troops. The fighting started on Monday between armed residents and a market in the state capital, Kadugli. Authorities imposed a round-the-clock curfew for 3 days to stabilize the situation. The clashes have been blamed on the previous theft of livestock in a village south of Kadugli. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, security forces have reportedly killed 20 militants near the border with Niger. A military statement said the attackers were killed during a foiled ambush in the northeastern province of Yaga. 8 soldiers also died in the fighting. Meanwhile, the prosecutor for the southeastern town of Fada Ngoma has reported the deaths of terrorist suspects. The 12 men were found dead in their police cells. The group was detained on Monday but are said to have died during the night. An investigation into the incident has been launched. And the Nigerian army has announced that its troops have killed 9 fighters from the Boko Haram militant group in the northeastern state of Borno. The militants had reportedly attempted to attack an army base located in the Mainok area. Meanwhile, the Nigerian police have also announced the killing of 15 people by suspected bandits. The incident happened in the northern state of Kaduna. Security forces in Nigeria have vowed to launch investigations and find those responsible. Nigeria has suffered a decade-long Boko Haram insurgency. Kaduna State, in particular, has endured numerous attacks. Now, turning to news from Somalia, thousands have fled towns and villages in Somalia's central region after water levels rose sharply in the Shabelle River. CGTN's Abdulaziz Billo reports from Mogadishu on how flooding has disrupted livelihoods in the region.
For weeks, these men have been constructing flood barriers along the Shabelle River to prevent flood water from reaching towns and villages. But the effort has not yielded tangible results. This is the situation in the town of Beledweyne, the second biggest city in central Somalia. Roads have been cut off with homes and businesses submerged in flood waters.
Flooding has disrupted lives for thousands of people living in Beledweyne. The lucky ones left the town and are living in a displacement camp. Others are trapped with nowhere to go.
We want an end to the recurring floods. We cannot be moving back and forth all the time. I have lost my children to these floods before, and I don't want that to happen again.
In the past week, more than 150,000 people have fled the town after authorities warned of possible flooding. Some have moved to surrounding towns, but the majority have moved to this empty space known as Al Jale.
In the last few weeks, we tried to create flood barriers as to minimize the impact of flood waters, but it has overpowered us, and we have advised our population to move to El Jale settlement, where we will provide transport, security, and basic needs.
Heavy rains have caused mass displacement across much of the country, including the death of more than a dozen people. The situation is, however, worse in Beledweyne. It's the second flooding in less than 6 months, and comes as authorities struggle to contain a potential outbreak of the coronavirus.
The latest flood is posing a health challenge for people in this region. We want people to maintain social distance and at the same time protect them from COVID-19 and waterborne diseases.
Mogadishu says that more than $1 million has been set aside to mitigate the crisis. Locals, however, accuse the government of failing to provide the funds early enough, forcing thousands to flee from a crisis many say could easily be averted. Abdulaziz Billo, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
You're watching Africa Live. Coming up in your business news. Falling global crude prices give Nigeria an opportunity to cancel its controversial fuel subsidy. And 3 million South Africans apply for the state's new grant, about $20, amid the ongoing coronavirus pandemic.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues for taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Nigeria's petrol subsidy has long been a contentious issue, costing the country billions of dollars a year. Previous attempts by the government to remove the subsidy have been resisted and met with general strikes. But with the collapse of the global crude price, forcing the domestic price of petrol to come down significantly, the government has decided this is the best time to remove that subsidy. Here's CGTN's Deji Badmus with more.
The move to scrap fuel subsidies is a big gamble by the government, but one it is hoping might work out eventually without any blowback. Experts though say the policy is fundamentally flawed and could be defeated if the government doesn't embark on full deregulation of the country's downstream petroleum sector.
This is the most auspicious time for the government to deregulate, because if they deregulate, the price of petroleum products or price of PMS, that is premium motor spirit, will come below what it is today. And when international prices begin to go up, the citizens will realize that this is a deregulated product and the government does not need to fix the price. And so if they have to pay more to buy fuel at the pump head, they will accept it. But if that does not happen until the price of crude starts to go up again, the government will find it difficult to remove the subsidy, or will find it difficult to deregulate.
There are three components to fuel subsidy. There is the under recovery, which is what I think they have removed. There's another component to do with FX subsidy, because they get foreign exchange at a lower rate than you would get in the exporter and investors window. And then there's a third component to do with taxes. So taxes such as VAT by law are applicable on petrol and other petroleum products, but they haven't been charged. They've been suspended for years. That's also a form of subsidy. Before you start adjusting the price of pump price to something else, you need to make sure that all those free subsidies are removed. And if you do that, that can easily add about 2 trillion to government revenue.
Indeed, completely removing the subsidy would save the country billions of dollars it could put to better use elsewhere in the economy. The petrol subsidy is a very sensitive political issue in Africa's largest oil producer.
If you deregulate that downstream today, in less than 2 years, the price of petrol can go as high as 500 naira per liter. But if we were to be refining locally, if prices of crude oil go up, that quantity we have that we will refine locally, we will sell them here and make good money. Then the other one we export, we make good money.
So far, there hasn't been any complaint about the new policy of the government from the usual quarters, the labor unions. And part of that could be because the current price of petrol is lower than what it was selling before. But things may change when the global price of crude rebounds, as that would certainly push domestic petrol prices up. So it's actually still early days to tell if the government has really done away with the country's controversial subsidy for good. Deji Badmus, CGTN, Lagos.
Libya's central bank says oil revenues will drop by almost 84% this year. The North African country highly depends on revenue from its petroleum industry, which represents over 95% of export earnings and 60% of GDP. CGTN's Adel Al-Mahrawi has the details.
Libya's central bank is warning that oil revenues in 2020 could drop to just $5 billion if the closure of oil fields continues. It's a sharp drop from the $31 billion reported last year. Since January 18, on the eve of the Berlin-Libya conference, all Libya's oil fields controlled by the Libyan National Army forces have shut down.
Libya has unfortunately faced losses estimated at $4.5 billion since January because of the lockdown led by some parties. They have put forward some conditions, among them to change the head of the National Oil Authority and to relocate its headquarters to Benghazi. They have also demanded the sacking of the head of the central bank, who has been authorizing major finances to the militias supporting the government of national accord.
The LNA-enforced oil siege has deprived the country from its only significant source of foreign currency. Now the fiscal deficit is forecasted to widen to $19 billion from a surplus of $1.8 billion in 2019, depriving Libyans from basic necessities, including electricity.
Libyans are definitely suffering tremendously. There is an economic recession. It lost some $100 billion since 2011 in finances spent on arms and militias. Libya has lost investments poured into oil, gas and infrastructure because of the volatile security situation.
The only oil field officially operating is Al Bouri. It produces some 30,000 barrels a day, all of which exported to Italy. This oil field in the northwest is controlled by the government of National Accord, which has been fending off the LNA's military offensive on the capital Tripoli for more than a year now. But most of the country's oil production comes from the east and south regions, which General Khalifa Haftar's LNA forces control. International restrictions have given the Libyan National Oil Company exclusive rights to trade in the nation's oil. The company is currently based in Tripoli. It wires its revenues to the central bank, which the GNA controls. The lack of balance in distributing oil revenues has encouraged the LNA forces to keep the oil lockdown enforced. The step has not stopped the civil war, though. With official oil exports dropping by more than 92%, Libya's economy is sinking under these dire circumstances. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
And on to South Africa now, where 3 million people have already applied for the state's new $20 a month grant. Applications for the grant opened on Monday. The monthly special grant is intended to provide money to unemployed South Africans who receive no other form of assistance from government. If all 3 million applicants are successful, the state would pay out an additional $566 million a month. That's about half its current monthly social grants bill. Government has also upped payouts to other grants by $269.4 million a month during this time when other sources of income have been disrupted. The Solidarity Fund, meanwhile, has raised $145.3 million. Those funds come from 175,000 individuals and more than 1,500 companies and foundations. Still in South Africa, MTN Group is sticking to its medium-term forecast, unlike some companies, as it posted higher core earnings for the first quarter of 2020. However, the mobile operator cut its capital expenditure guidance for 2020 to around $1.1 billion from $1.5 billion when it reported 2019 results in March. MTN says while this financial year will be challenging, the company is maintaining its 3 to 5 year medium-term guidance for now. Group service revenue for the 3 months ended March 31 rose by 11.1%, while earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization jumped by 15.6%. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell says the United States could face an extended period of weak growth and stagnant incomes. Powell added that the downturn will likely be significantly worse than any recession since World War II. He pledged to use more Fed power as needed and issued a direct call for more fiscal spending. Powell also said additional fiscal support could be costly but worth it if it helps avoid long-term damage and leaves the economy with a stronger recovery. The U.S. Congress has already allocated $3 trillion for economic relief.
Avoidable household and business insolvencies can weigh on growth for years to come. Long stretches of unemployment can damage or end workers' careers as their skills lose value and professional networks dry up, and leave families in greater debt. The loss of thousands of small and medium-sized businesses across the country would destroy the life's work and family legacy of many businesses and community leaders, and limit the strength of the recovery when it comes.
Meanwhile, some parts of the U.S. have already begun reopening businesses and others are debating plans to get their economies moving. CGTN's Roy Ruttenberg looks at some of the advantages and problems they could run into.
Across the country, hair salons, restaurants, cinemas, and gyms in some places welcoming people back. Eagerly, but cautiously, with new guidelines in place, masks to be worn, capacities limited, and social distances maintained. But that may prove difficult in some places, like in the air. Americans are starting to fly again. The number of passengers going through security is at its highest level in 6 weeks.
There's a smart way to do this. We need to ensure that we're doing everything we can to prevent unnecessary additional preventable risk for our passengers.
Some parents are eager to get their kids back to school. But is it safe?
I had 39 kids in my classroom one year. How are you going to socially distance 39 kids?
With many states pushing to reopen even before meeting Washington's criteria to do so, public health experts are warning of a possible surge in new infections and deaths. In some states, infection rates are still going up. Officials are trying to balance those concerns with the economic cost of remaining closed.
The scope and speed of this downturn are without modern precedent, significantly worse than any recession since World War II.
In Las Vegas, culinary workers told they'll soon go back to work staged a drive-by protest. They're demanding transparency in the state's plan to reopen casinos, a major source of revenue for Nevada. Specifically, they want to see the safety plans for doing so. The University of California said it's unlikely its campuses will reopen in the fall. That includes UCLA and UC Berkeley. It affects more than 250,000 college students, including thousands from China. And Broadway's bright lights will remain dimmed through the summer. But the Trump administration has largely left the critical decisions on how and when to reopen to the states, giving only guidance. President Trump has been pushing Americans to get back to work. White House officials say there is a risk, but note there's a risk to everything. Roy Ruttenberg, CGTN in Washington.
Let's take a short break. Your sports news up next. Coming up, South Africa's NTT Pro Cycling takes stock of coronavirus disruptions.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
NTT Pro Cycling is Africa's premier cycling team and boasts 29 riders from 15 different countries. But the team born in South Africa is dealing with life under global lockdown, where logistically it's proving tough to keep their riders motivated and positive ahead of the resumption of the racing calendar. CGTN's CS Du Plessis has more.
The international cycling